I'd like to introduce you the chair of this panel, who is a lecturer in Galatasaray University Sociology Department, also founding president of the Migration Studies Center. She's worked for a long time in social democracy and supported the Ranting Foundation in many of the studies. She's someone that we go to for a lot of questions we have, a lot of requests we have. Hello to everyone. Hopefully you can hear me well. Let me first of all take this opportunity to say a big thank you to you and to all of your colleagues who contributed to the organization of this event. In this day and age, we are quite directly faced with racism and discrimination, and social inequalities are being pronounced with discrimination and hate speech, and especially in these times of coronavirus where we are locked down in our houses, we have social media, which is turned into a new platform for hate speech, housing hate speech, and we are witnessing this phenomenon most of the time, even if we're not directly exposed to it. And the refugees are some of the groups that are worst affected by hate speech because they're not any group at all. We've heard important and very good presentations in previous panels, but not just in Turkey, but especially in Europe, in the Western world. Anti-refugee hate speech has become very prominent, especially in political speeches and on other platforms. In 2015, circa 2015, there was a huge wave of migration towards Europe, and Europeans mostly called it a refugee crisis, but it was, for most academics, including myself, was a management crisis. And migration itself is used as a negative label, a negative speech too. And one of the most frequent places where we most frequently see anti-refugee speeches, that is social media. And our next speaker is Şükrü Şimdi, has worked on a lot of signature campaigns in Change.org, and he's going to share with us his analysis of anti-Syrian signature campaigns in Turkey. To introduce him briefly, he started his studies in journalism in Ege University, communication faculty. He is currently doing his master's degree in the communication faculty of Çukurova University. He has done some work in Demirtaş neighborhood, which is a multi-layered neighborhood, which is a widely discussed neighborhood. He did a case study in that neighborhood and worked on the perceptions of the native neighborhood members of the neighborhood towards Syrian refugees. And this is a neighborhood that has received migration from various parts of the country. So it is quite an interesting place to look at. And based on a similar analysis, he did some work on the cases from Change.org as well, which he will present to you right now. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. First and foremost, let me thank everyone who shared their time with us and who contributed to the organization of this event. Let me start sharing my study with you, and I'd like to share my screen.
As for the content of an outline of my speech, I'll be talking about the introduction, Syrians in Turkey, and I'll talk about the methodology and the findings. Well, my work is based on Change.org and stigmatizing and discriminatory discourse that is constructed through change signature campaigns, particularly regarding Syrian refugees in Turkey. We see that the hate practices and Syrian xenophobia and anti-Syrian sentiment is on the rise, and according to the Syrian barometer's latest results, there's a diversion from the social acceptance to tolerance. And in the rhetoric, the identity, Syrian identity, is centered around being a guest, and now there's a stigmatization process as they are recognized and described as such. Well, there are two different theories. One is social identity, the other one is stigmatization. Social identity focuses on differences and similarities, making categories, social categories more precise. And Goffman's sigma theory defines tools for categorization, and individuals make this ordinary and natural. There's an area that is marked with inconsistencies and stereotypes, and the stigmatization is about the type of relationship that feeds from this area. In fact, there is a group that is exposed to tribal stigma, which is based on ethnicity. And stigmatization makes lack of communication more intense, creating distances, and the groups form their own strategies. This is important, particularly regarding recent work regarding Syrians. We observe this frequently. Now we see that the groups have become more introvert. And in this new media environment, we also see prominent examples of hate and discriminatory discourse. Frequently, regarding Syrians too, particularly in 2016, the president at the time talked about the possibility of granting Syrians citizenship, which resulted in intense debate and also intense hate speech. In fact, this could be read as the distinct form of cultural and national distinct form of anti-immigrant sentiment. And I based the migration discourse on Van Dijk's critical discourse analysis, and specifically the information regarding migrants are generalized, phenomena are used, and the dichotomies between us and them is used. As for the questions, while I was forming the questions, first and foremost, I looked at helping and others, which has a particular focus on creation, petition, and talks about a different performativity, a specific performativity. So there's an emphasis on not including hate speech in the content. And Change.org is a specific platform as such that has a creation petition. And we looked at which are the contexts and social representations used for Syrians, whether stereotypes are used, is there tribal stigma, and if there is anti-Syrian sentiment, which arguments and strategies are used. And as for the methodology, using the keyword Syrian, and this is not random, of course, the selection, we looked at studies and we used that keyword to define this group. And I reached 154 campaign texts. We looked at the creators, authors, and counterparts, headlines, and transformed them into data. In fact, there's a counterpart in these campaigns. And generally, these are government authorities, governmental authorities. And as for the thematic analysis, we have main categories and subcategories. The main categories are Syrians, virtual social identities, stigmatization, Syrian male stereotypes, and subcategories are economic problems, guest potential, enemy, lazy, beggar, uh, those who stink, immorals, traitors, fertile, and terrorists. Those are the concepts and notions that we used. As for our findings, in the campaign texts, Syrians are subject to stereotyping and ethnicized stereotyping as a stigmatized representation, and they are positioned against the Turkish national identity. They are ethnicized along where necessary with historic and daily references. So there is a distinct Syrian identity that is created, and there's a homogeneous and ethnic context to it. Also, in the texts, we see historical arguments being used and the tendency to use a natural link between Syrian for Syrian virtual social identity, linking historical references with potential future outlook. And homogeneous identity imagination. For instance, tomorrow they can rise against us in the future. They may rise against us. We have no other friends than ourselves. We have always been alone as the Turkish nation. And we cannot feel sorry for the Syrians anymore. There are historical references that are being used to create this climate of potential danger. And in the discourse, we see that the discourse is being based on non-government informal nationalism. Groups are being criminalized, and the events are associated with the group identity, and there's an emphasis on ethnicity, and there's an effort to move the rhetoric from a rational to an irrational area, terrain. Here in this example, we see a dog that is allegedly killed by two Syrian children, and we see that there's an exposure to hate speech and discrimination. Such texts have reached many supporters, a great number of supporters, and one of the mostly used discourse against refugees is that they are blamed for the poor status of the economy. They are seen as an economic problem. They strain on limited economic resources. They receive a lot of aid from the government, and at some point, this turns into a racist tendency. The economy-based arguments against migrants turn into this type of approach. And these are mostly based on distorted information, and it is changed to favor a group identity and represented in a biased way. We also see different presentations of masculinity. Our brave soldiers, Turkish soldiers, and Syrian Syrian men who desert the army. And here we see that there are qualities such as being masculine, being a warrior nation, and on the other hand, there are qualities such as people fleeing war, running from war, or immorals. In fact, manhood is seen as within a collective understanding that in which men are supposed to continue the nation, as Nagia stated. We see that the age range is between 18 to 45, which corresponds to the strong male prototype. You have 5 more minutes. If you could use your time accordingly. Yes. Homeland means honor. Syrian men should own their honor. Therefore, we should collect Syrian citizens across Turkey. Women and children should remain in camps, and men should be deported to own their honor. Demonic masculinity serves a purpose. It helps us compare different types of masculinity and see which are the stereotypes used for such different understandings of masculinity. And there's an ethnocentric perspective regarding Syrians. There's an emphasis on being Turk and kinship. That's the basis for the creation, an effort to create migrants. And there's a distance that is defined regarding Syrians, Iraqi and Afghans, and Turkish national identity and kinship is used as a concept. This group is associated with the status of refugees, while others with Turkic origin are not. So there's an emphasis on kinship, and an ideal migration concept is being defined while delineating the position of Syrians. And the Syrians fall out of the boundaries of the established construct. And there's an ethnocentric perspective used for refugees, and there are negative descriptions for certain groups. Stigmatization and cultural racism feeds from that, this basis. And in the text, we see a new type of racism that is based on national dynamics and cultural dynamics. This is different from scientific racism in that there's a lack of acceptance and looking down on certain identities. There's a difference between being, there's a description of being less migrant. In fact, there's also an effort to protect the homogeneous status of the Turkish identity in attacking other identities. This is an imagined community which imposes a reflex on the others, to alienating the others. They're trying to create a distance with regard to such groups, such other groups. Keeping the potential danger alive is based on the fear that the identity will lose its core, and there's a distancing and alienation, othering, using a rational practice. The Turkishness is being used in particular. Just to share our conclusions, refugee represents a secondary status that is used for other migrant groups than Turks. Syrian identity is based on a virtual social identity that is stigmatized with stereotypes. There's a distance created using hegemonic masculinity and informal nationalization dynamics, and a discourse feeds on this, and this results in discrimination and hate practices in the new media, which is important for public participation. An example is change.org. And anti-migrant sentiment is clustered in a homogeneous manner there. In fact, these are the things that we observe in other Syrian-related studies, but in the new media and on social platforms, we see a very different example. Thank you. Thank you, Şükrü. It was not easy to present this briefly. I'd like to thank the interpreter. We're trying to interpret your speech, as you were reading. In fact, there's from your presentation, there's a focus on so-called acceptable groups, such as women or children or kins. Well, we could link this to our other speakers. The title is Examining the Role and Influence of Gendered Power Dynamics Across the Challenges of Violence and Discrimination Impacting Syrian Refugee Women in Turkey. We have 3 participants who will deliver their presentation together. I will speak in Turkish, but they will present in English. I would now like to briefly present them. For those who haven't participated in our conferences before, from the interpretation button below, please select the relevant language channel Turkish, or Turkish, Chinese, or English. Well, all our three speakers come from the Center for Progressive Security. Ms. Tannuja Rozario is the Director of Research at the Center for Progressive Security. She's also currently a PhD student in Sociology and Advanced Feminist Studies at the University of Massachusetts. Her research interests are gender and sexuality, human rights, law, and society. She also teaches at the Gender Studies and Political Science Department at John Jay College, CUNY. She's also the founder of a gender justice organization, South Queens Women's March, and she serves as a consultant for many other gender justice organizations. So she's both in academia and an activist. The second presenter will be Ms. Maria Kumskova. She also comes from the same center as a program director. She was part of many projects in the field of human rights. She has a particular focus on counterterrorism activities, enforced disappearances, and treatment of terrorist suspects. She added the peace and security word to her portfolio by joining the Women Peace Security Program of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. The third speaker is the Executive Director of the same center and Senior Programs Managers at Atlas Relief and Development International, Ms. Katie Krueger. Katie is an experienced international development practitioner using intersectional conflict, human rights, gender-sensitive lenses across a wide range of programmatic areas. She focuses on peace building, civil society strengthening, capacity building, research, refugee integration, preventing extremism. I will be giving the floor to our presenter, but I would like to remind you that you have 15 minutes, so in order for us to have time for Q&A, and there are many questions coming in the chat box. We will be allocating time to that during the Q&A session. You have the floor, Katie.
Hello everyone, merhabalar, hoş geldiniz herkese. I am so excited to be here today, and so is all of our group. I would first like to thank all of you for being here, and also to thank the Hrant Dink Foundation for providing this incredible digital space to explore such an important and timely subject matter. So today, within our presentation, our team will be sharing insights from a current community-based survey project that we have collaboratively led in Istanbul that sheds light on the role and influence of gendered power dynamics across the challenges of violence and discrimination impacting Syrian women and men in Turkey. So Atlas Relief and Development International and the Center for Progressive Security, we worked as partners together to co-design a community-based survey in close collaboration with a Syrian women's collective called the Hayat Syrian Refugee Women's Collective Group. And this is a group of women-led, highly diverse Syrian refugee women based in the Fatih and Esenyurt districts of Istanbul. And they are working together through a project led by ARDI to conduct community-based activities that impact and benefit the Syrian refugee community in their areas. So as a group between ARDI, CPS, and the Hayat women, we really believe in participatory, action-oriented research. And therefore, we work together to ensure that the Syrian members of the Hayat Women's Collective were really at the forefront of designing and disseminating the survey that we have designed together. And this survey really delves more deeply into 38 different questions that were working to understand the experiences, the challenges, barriers, and perspectives among Syrian refugee women and men in Turkey, and especially within the neighborhoods I mentioned, since they have higher levels of refugee populations. Through the survey, we had 3 main guiding questions that really helped us form the scope of what we were wanting to look at and understand. The first section we looked at are some of the ways that gender power is maintained within Turkish communities, especially when it comes to the rhetoric around Syrian refugees and their community needs and challenges. The second section we looked at was the impact of online and in-person hate speech and discrimination, and how this rhetoric really impacts the experiences of Syrian refugees living in these communities. And the third area we looked at was looking at how this rhetoric has emerged from the communities. What are the root causes? And to what extent does the Syrian refugee community have an influence or an impact over this rhetoric? So from our experience, we know that gender norms and the underlying power dynamics are really deeply entrenched in the structures of all societies. And, this can also be used as discrimination against people from various different backgrounds. As a society, when it is homogenous, it's really hard to see these structures. They're not very visible. But when crises happen or mass migration and movement of people happens, this can really impact the dynamics being more visible. And they can create more restrictions for people that are often seen as foreigners, especially when they are women. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it to my colleague. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. We have integrated gender analysis at the core of the survey. That's what we say, but what really gender analysis means for us. As the previous presenter has already mentioned, the national political landscape, including the state of social, security, and economic systems, are infused and determined by gender relationships of power, where those identified with masculinities are immediately associated with power, privilege, rationality, and therefore favored in gaining access to control over resources. Based on this relationship of power, people perceive their identities and determine their sense of belongings. Those closer to power feel more privileged and create limitations for others to join, building what is called national identities. When social, economic, political structures denied marginalized groups, such as refugees, their agency and frame them as victims, we call it a feminization of the issue, where people's individual needs, identities become irrelevant and their victimhood drives their access to resources. Next, when national identities are challenged and require adjustments, elites in power use this victimhood to legitimize their action to contain power. We call it securitization of the issue. Social, economic, legal barriers and the lack of political agency together create spaces for reinforcing gender power and driving marginalization of those outside national identities and through the breach of trust and lack of dialogue. This marginalization, however, should not be understood as a claim that marginalized communities are more likely to be radicalized, because radicalization depends not only on external factors, but also on a variety of other factors, and in many ways personal factors that create and reinforce individual power and resistance that prevent people from radicalization. These forces are individual strengths, community of support, and other development factors. Taking both power dynamics and personal resilience factors into consideration, we have developed a survey through collaborative approach with the Hayat Syrian Refugee Women's Collective to make sure that participants can not only use this survey to express their challenges, the experiences that they're facing, but also engaging with this survey and kind of understand what are the crucial sources of power that can gain both from their own communities, from their own selves, but also from the host community. The data for which we present findings today is based on the sample of 194 participants from refugee communities in Turkey. Of them, 70 are male and 124 are female, predominantly between ages 18 to 60 of different backgrounds and different legal statuses within Turkey. The survey examined 4 key areas. So the first one is economic, social, and political factors that impact the refugees' sense of belonging in Turkey. The second one is prevalence of online and in-person hate speech towards refugees and asylum seekers. The third one is impact of increasing disinformation and the rise of fake news in the wake of COVID-19. And fourth is the extent to which refugees are meaningfully engaged in the decisions that affect them. So I will now pass it to Tannuja to share some of the findings of our research.
Thank you, Marina. I will now talk about the findings that we have collected so far from the surveys that we have done. So thus far in our research, we have found that hate speech was a common experience among Syrian refugees in their host community. Most of the hate speech that they experienced occurred online, although numerous respondents also reported that they experienced hate speech and discrimination in person. The majority of survey respondents stated that they experienced hate speech online through the social media, which was reported by 69.6% of the participants. While other outlets, such as things that they see on television, newspaper or magazines, and statements made by the government, were also other outlets where they experienced hate speech. Respondents also noted that there was a strong power in the media to shape people's opinions in Turkey and perpetuate discriminatory narratives that incite violence, especially shaping the way that young Turks react to refugees. 46.9% of the sample reported that social media bullying does affect their sense of belonging. Hate speech was also found to be very common in public spaces. Hate speech occurred in the very neighborhoods that they were living in and the public spaces where they go to work, where they go to shop, and simply carrying out daily life activities. 34.5% of participants state that they experience hate speech in their very own neighborhoods. 40.7% of participants stated that they experience hate speech in public spaces in Istanbul. And 35.6% of participants experience hate speech in stores and markets. These high levels of targeting, particularly the violence faced by women within their host community, have a deep-rooted impact on refugees and asylum seekers' mental health, sense of belonging, and feeling of safety in the very areas in which they live in their host community. Within the survey open-ended questions, it provided space for respondents to share their personal experiences with insights relevant to each focus area. Looking at the experiences around hate speech, several respondents share their personal stories that shed light on the severity of hate speech they experience on a regular basis. One participant from Izmir district stated that it happened many times that when I go to the supermarket and wait for my turn at the cashier counter, employees would keep inviting Turkish guys to take my turn and sending me to the end of the line, insulting me with bad words because I'm a Syrian. This woman talks about the hate speech she experienced while carrying out a daily activity in the supermarket. The hate speech was targeted against her identity as a Syrian. Another woman from the Izmir district stated that she experienced hate speech as well based on her identity. She states, people yell at her by saying, "Go back to your country. Our men die while you are enjoying your life." This is also exacerbated as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, where statements like, "Let Corona take Syrians and not us," meaning the Turkish nationals, have become prevalent. Across the overall survey findings, ethnic and cultural identity was found to be a significant driver that prompts hate speech against Syrian refugees. Other factors for hate speech in public spaces were language ability and legal status. Syrian refugee women were also more likely to experience in-person violence in big cities and public spaces, perpetuated by strangers in their host communities. The major reason for violence are perceived by legal status, cultural affiliation, followed by language abilities. One male participant talks about the gender-based violence that his wife experienced in a public space. He states, "My wife was beaten by a woman security official in the government hospital for no reason at all." Experience such as this highlight the ways in which the governmental institutions, even health-focused bodies, may also perpetuate discrimination, even physical violence against vulnerable communities. Interestingly, the majority of survey respondents agree that young people from the Turkish host community are largely responsible for perpetuating these forms of hate speech and physical violence. A significant concern highlighted also by the members of the Hayat Women's Collective is the discrimination faced by refugees and asylum seekers in the workplace. Syrian refugees work for lower wages than the Turkish nationals. Women have also reported instances of sexual harassment at work. In an initial group interview with the members of the Hayat Women's Collective, they shed light on the Syrian women being asked for favors, such as being pressured to accept marriage's proposals, and other forms of gender-based violence and harassment at work. When victims attempt to stand up for their rights, they were intimidated by employers and threatened to leave their job and move to another city. Many reported that a desire to seek legal support to address such experiences, including the common experience of withheld wages, but in the end, most were unable to afford those legal costs and were unaware of those free resources that were available to them. Survey respondents largely reported seeking recourse in their own communities, largely in their own networks of Syrian friends and families, as many believe that the Turkish law does not protect the refugee community effectively and their own Syrian networks. One important thing to note is that refugees are supported by humanitarian agencies, and the host governments often receive additional support to host refugees. In rhetoric, however, it creates a sense of marginalization, victimhood, and this idea of foreigners. Lastly, 3.8% of the survey respondents reported that they filed a government report to share evidence of hate speech, such as videos, pictures, and names. Such low reporting indicates that even following an incident of hate speech, they were not able or willing to actually report that because there was a lack of trust of the effectiveness of the host community's justice system. I'll now pass it on to Katie to conclude our presentation.
Thank you so much, Tannuja. So we've seen that gendered power dynamics are really triggered and then become more visible when you're working with a group of marginalized people, such as Syrian refugees, and especially women Syrian refugees. There are refugees and asylum seekers who face hate speech within social media and other media resources. They often even encounter it on the street as a secondary form. And we found that primarily it is younger groups of host members from the Turkish community that often perpetuate this type of violence and hate speech against people, which was a surprising encounter for us to find through our survey. Overall, we found that the needs of Syrian refugees continue to be misunderstood. However, the survey has demonstrated that one of the ways that they have been misunderstood is that they're really never engaged actively and directly with decisions that are being made for them about their lives, about their status, about the resources and services that they need to access. And this lack of engagement can really just emphasize the differences between the host community and the refugee community. This also connects back to the issue of power and power dynamics within institutions, and also the commitment to maintain power through decision-making, rather than building systems that are working in partnership with the people that they're trying to serve. And this is not only detrimental, but it really has the ability to stop the transformation of bringing communities together and making sure that the services and resources available to them actually impact and benefit their ability to live fulfilling lives within their host community. So based on the insight and the important information we've gained through this survey, ARDI and CPS will continue working with the Hayat Syrian Women's Collective over the next 12 months. We're going to be helping them to use the findings from the survey to do several different things. The first of which will be to host a task force networking meeting among different stakeholders from the civil society, from the governmental institution, from activists, from community leaders, both on the Turkish and the Syrian side, to bring people together to really share understanding of what the reality is like on the ground. And also, CPS and ARDI will be working with the Syrian women from the Hayat group to put together a list of policy and practice recommendations that are built off of the findings of this survey. And this will be disseminated to stakeholders within the community who have the power to make changes that can actually deeply impact the well-being and livelihoods of Syrians and Turkish community on the ground.
Katie, is it we are running out of
Oh,
time?
apologize.
So, okay.
Thank you so much. That's really it. We just want to thank you all so much for being here, and we're looking forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sağ ol. Çok teşekkürler. Üç konuşmacımıza da Katie, Marina ve
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all three of our speakers, because they've touched upon a very important gender dimension of hate speech in terms of those who are exposed to, victimized by hate speech as well. To wrap up very briefly what the speech consisted of. And it consisted of marginalizing these people. Hate speech is turning into a marginalization tool. And during the second speech, it was said that refugees are forced to turn into each other and turn into limiting themselves to get those, so to speak, as we most often see in Europe. That is something to avoid, and is also a huge risk on integration. And we've talked about different dimensions of hate speech in two speeches that we've listened to. We have traditional media on the one hand, and Şükrü has talked to us about how it was expressed in the new media. And during the second speech, we heard that individual speech and hate speech in public spaces sometimes turn into physical violence.